Hello everyone, I am Chandana Alawattagi and I am back here to do my third lecture on content analysis. In my very first lecture on this particular topic, we discussed the conceptual foundation of content analysis. And in the second lecture, we discussed the technical and procedural aspects of doing a quantitative content analysis. Now, in this lecture, we will be discussing technical and procedural aspects of doing a qualitative content analysis. So, as usual, let us begin by explaining our learning objectives. So, in a broader sense, after following this introductory lecture and after reading the recommended reading for this particular topic, you should be able to design your research project using qualitative content analysis as your research methodology. In other words, or more specifically, you should be able to think about the key elements of your research project or the key elements of your research process in terms of a qualitative content analysis. In our previous lecture, we discussed that quantitative content analysis translate the qualitative secondary data into numerical or quantitative data so that you can use statistics to test a hypothesis. That is because the quantitative content analysis is a positivistic research tradition and it makes knowledge claim through testing hypotheses. In contrast, qualitative content analysis is a post-positivistic research tradition. It relies upon social constructivism or interpretivism in making its knowledge claim. It does not use hypothetical deductivism or hypothesis testing in making its knowledge claim. That is because a qualitative researcher, a post-positivistic researcher, think about the reality as a peculiar or a particular or a unique situation. So your reality problem or your research problem is a unique, particular reality problem. And ontologically, you don't think that particular reality problem can be empirically generalized to every situation in a so-called population. Therefore, your reality situation, your data set is not a sample. And it is not a sample through which you are going to make a generalizable claim about a population. No, it is not. In the case of a qualitative research, this particular data set is not a sample, but it is a site. It is a specific case that tells a particular story, a particular narrative, a particular argument, which is not going to be generalized into a population. So this idea of peculiarity, this idea of uniqueness, this idea of non-generalization is very important when you are thinking about qualitative content analysis. So, when it comes to understand the key element of the research process, still we will have the first element of the research process, which is the specification or definition or clarification of your research problem. As I mentioned earlier, irrespective of whatever the research methodology you are using, the definition or clarification of the research problem is the ideal starting point of your research. So even in the case of qualitative content analysis, that is the starting point. So we will discuss how the adoption of a qualitative content analysis should frame the manner in which you define and clarify your research problem. However, as I already mentioned, when it comes to analysis, in a qualitative content analysis, you do not deploy sampling or statistical testing and hypothesis testing. So that particular element of having a statistical framework a set of variables and a statistical formula and a sample does not apply here. Instead, still you have to clarify, explain, and justify the set of data that you are using. You don't call it a sample because you are not trying to connect that data set to another population using a statistical technique to generalize. So instead of calling it a sample, you may call it the research site or the empirical site or the textual site in which you are carrying out your content analysis. So that is important. So the second element is clarifying your textual site. And then third element of your research process is coding. So still, like in the quantitative content analysis, you would carry out a coding. But that coding process is not directed toward the quantification, not directed toward identifying numbers which can be used in statistical techniques to test a hypothesis. Instead, you are developing your codes, you are still doing coding in order to identify themes, in order to identify various concepts or salient defining concepts. And because that themes, that concepts, that keywords will be the basic building blocks through which you will be telling your basic story, narrative, or develop your argument. So the coding process or the analytical process of coding still applies. And then you will report it, you will present it. So we have to discuss how a qualitative content analyst would present his or her data analysis. So that element is still applicable. So these are the 4 key elements of your research process that we would be discussing today. And we will be discussing how the use of a qualitative content analysis would frame each of these elements. And as in the case of our previous lecture, we will explain these elements using an example, a journal paper. In this lecture, to explain the qualitative content analysis, the paper that I am going to use is the paper by Roy Zudabi and his colleagues, which is published in Accounting, Organizations and Society, one of the highest ranking journal in accounting. And this paper would provide a good example of how you can think about each of the key elements of your research process in terms of a qualitative content analysis. Now, going to our first key element, defining the research problem. As I mentioned in my previous lecture, when it comes to the definition of research problem, in the context of a content analysis, I mentioned that the definition of research problem should be located, or your research problem should be located within the duality between the reality and the textualized reality. You have to clarify your research problem, one which relates to a connection, a particular connection between your reality situation and the text or the textualized reality that reality creates itself. Now, going to this particular example paper, Roy Zudabi and his colleagues' paper. So they are interested in a very interesting reality situation or a reality problem. That is how the accounting firms expand their domain of expertise. We know that the accountants as a professionals claim a particular expertise in a set of domains. Conventionally, it has been financial reporting, double entry bookkeeping and so on, tax, audit, and management accounting and so on. So this conventional domains of expertise has been expanded, especially when the accounting firms became big and large, conglomerate, multinational firms, especially the big four firms. When the big four firms are huge, large, global firms, they became more of a consultancy firms. And now they claim the expertise in quite a large set of domains. So these authors in this paper want to explain and explore how this expansion of the expertise of accountancy has been expanded. And they pay special attention not to the act done by the big accounting professional associations, but rather how this particular domain expansion is taking place through the day-to-day mundane actions by a set of accountants or expertise in their project works. So their attention is on micro level actions and activities or the work that the accountants do to expand their domain of expertise. So, reading the relevant literature, reading the relevant theories, they initially conceptualized that such domain expansion would take place through three kind of work, three kind of what they call institutional work. The first one is they call the boundary work. So the boundary work is those kind of work through which they expand the boundaries of organizational activities. And the second one they call rhetorical work, the communicative work, the manner in which they communicate the expertise. And third one is the construction of the embedded actor. So they construct an accountant or actor or a social agent as an embedded actor of a particular field of expertise. So the accountant gets embedded in a particular field of expertise, a new field of expertise. So the construction of that embedded actor is also what they call an institutional work through which the firms can expand their domain of expertise. So these three conceptual parameters or conceptual elements have been drawn by reading the literature and theory. So with that in mind, so they locate their research problem within a duality between the real and the textualized. So the real problem they want to understand is the manner in which the accountant's domain of expertise is expanded through boundary work, through rhetorical work, and through the construction of embedded actor. So that is the reality problem or the reality condition they want to see. And then they see such expansionary work, such boundary work, rhetorical work, and the construction of embedded actor takes place in a specific textual space. That is the social media. So they want to see how this work takes place in the social media, especially LinkedIn, Facebook, and the Twitter. So they call it Twitter in the change. How the change is enacted and enabled through the text that the big four firms create in LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. So now you get the connection. So here is a reality problem, how the domain of expertise get expanded through three forms of institutional work. And how that institutional work or the three forms of institutional work, that expansionary work, takes place in a particular textual site, textual space, that is the social media. So how that social media reproduces, expand the domain of accounting expertise. So that is the manner in which they locate their research problem. That's the manner in which they explain and clarify their research problem within a duality between real and the textual. Now, with that particular contextual conditions, contextual environment, and with their specification of three forms of expansionary work or institutional work. So they specify three specific research questions here. So these three specific research questions are related to the three forms of institutional work through which the expansion takes place in the domain or in the textual space of social media. The first research question that they are talking about is related to the boundary work. So that's the first question. So they want to ask what forms of boundary work have large professional accounting firms engage with as a result of adoption of new work or new social media. So how the social media create a new form of boundary work which expand the domain of expertise. And the second research question, how has the content of domain claims of professional expertise changed in new media, and what is the nature of engagement of big four accounting firms in this process? That's the rhetorical work. So in other words, what form of rhetorical work takes place in the textual space and how it expand the domain of expertise. That's their second question. And the third question is related to the construction of embedded agent. So that's the three questions they specifically spell out for their qualitative content analysis. To emphasize and to repeat and to summarize, when you are defining and clarifying your research question, like for example Sudhabi and his colleagues did, try your best to locate and contextualize your research problem within a duality between the real and the textual. For that end, you can use, if necessary, relevant literature as well as theories to clarify this particular connection. And then you spell out your specific research questions in that particular context. So you need a context for the research problem and then spell out your research problem in that particular context. And the context is the duality between real and the textual. Now, let us move to the second element of our research process, methodology. So as I mentioned earlier, when it comes to qualitative content analysis, qualitative content analysis is a post-positivistic, constructionist, or interpretivist research approach. Therefore, qualitative content analysis do not use hypothetical deductivism or hypothesis testing to make knowledge claims. So therefore, very often, qualitative content analysis will not have a kind of a conceptual or a statistical framework to test a hypothesis. However, there's a one point that we have to understand here. This does not mean that a qualitative content analysis necessarily do not use any numbers, do not use any numerical data, do not use any quantification in their analysis. No, they may use. Even a qualitative content analysis may use some statistics, some quantitative data or some numerical data. They still may convert some of their textual data, some of their qualitative data into numerical data. They still may do it, as in the case of Roy Sudhabi and his colleagues' paper. So they use qualitative textual data as well as they convert such data into certain numbers as well. But the difference is they will not use such numbers, such quantities, such statistics to test a hypothesis. So the hypothesis testing is not a part of the analytical process. So that's the difference between positivistic and the post-positivistic research. So qualitative content analysis as a post-positivistic research may involve some numbers in addition to other textual data. But such numbers would not be used to test hypotheses. They may simply use as descriptive statistics. That's a difference. Now, with that difference or emphasis in our mind, so when we are talking about methodology, in very generic sense, methodology involves two key elements, as the word methodology itself explains. So the first element of methodology is the method, and the second element of methodology is the logic or the logy. Methodology. So when you explain in your methodology, in your dissertation or in your paper, it would be a good idea to start your methodology discussion with a very brief and precise description of the logic behind your methodological choice. So in other words, you would explain why would you consider qualitative content analysis as the most appropriate methodological approach for your research. So you need to justify the overall methodological choice. Why would you consider qualitative content analysis as the most appropriate methodological approach for your specific research problem? So as I mentioned earlier, that justification comes from the nature of the problem itself and the manner in which you can locate that problem within a duality between real and the textual. So we discussed that one already. So that will provide the basis or the philosophical or logical basis upon which you can justify why qualitative content analysis. So after doing that, very briefly but precisely, you need to move into the major element of your methodological explanations. That is the method section. So when it comes to method, you are talking about two sub-elements. The first one is the methods or the techniques of data collection or data gathering. And second element is method or techniques of data analysis. So you have to explain the methods and techniques that you used in collecting your data set. So when you are doing a content analysis, ultimately you have to have a particular qualitative secondary data set, which you may call the textual site or the empirical site or your case in the qualitative content analysis. Or you may even call it your sample but in a different meaning, not in the same meaning as the quantitative content analyst would do. So this particular textual site, this particular data set, how did you construct it? How did you collect that particular data set? You have to explain. What is the process through which this particular data set is ultimately constructed and why? So you have to explain it. So that is the second element of your methodological explanation, how you constructed your data set. And the third element is, once you have this particular data set, how did you analyze? So you have to explain the process through which you analyze this particular data set. So that is actually the third element that we are going to talk here, the process of analysis or the process of coding. To summarize, when it comes to the explanation of your methodology, there are three key elements that you have to explain. The first one, the overall methodological approach or the logic of your methodological choice. Why qualitative content analysis? And the second element is the manner in which or the methods through which you created your data set. Or in other words, techniques of data collection. Explain it. And third, the process through which you analyzed the given data set. That's the third element. So now we are in the very core of our methodological process, the data analysis or coding. As we mentioned earlier, Coding is the basic fundamental process of data analysis in content analysis. Now, whether it is quantitative content analysis or it is qualitative content analysis, coding has to be done. So we have a set of secondary data, set of qualitative secondary data that we have to analyze. Now, in the case of quantitative content analysis, as we already discussed, the analysis is primarily, essentially, directed towards numerizing or quantification, so that you can use that data in statistical models to test a hypothesis. But here, in qualitative content analysis, you analyze data but not with such a purpose. We are not trying to develop a specific set of quantitative data so that we can use statistics to test a hypothesis. We don't do that. Instead, our aim is to identify salient themes, salient concepts, salient keywords through which we can construct an argument or a set of argument. So the construction of a particular argument or a set of argument is the purpose. So we are not trying to establish a knowledge claim through testing a hypothesis. Instead, we are trying to make a knowledge claim on the basis of constructing a particular narrative, particular story, or a particular argument, or a set of arguments. So you code the data in order to derive, in order to bring out specific set of themes, arguments, keywords, and so on. So therefore, the analytical process or the coding process is almost same as in the case of quantitative content analysis, but the purpose is different. So in this process of coding, as I already mentioned, a certain coding may be converting your textual data into numerical data. And then you may use that numerical, statistical, or quantitative data, but not to test a hypothesis, but to develop an argument, to construct an argument. Now, if you go back to our example paper by Roy Sudabi and his colleagues, you can see this particular way of using data or coding data. So it's very similar to Smith and Tafler's paper, the quantitative content analysis paper. These people also use a particular software package. Through that particular software package, these people, Sudabi and his colleagues, also convert some of their textual data into quantitative or numerical data. But the difference is, in this paper, you don't see any hypothesis. You don't see any hypothesis testing. Instead, what do you see? You see a specific set of arguments or themes developing through the data. So you are bringing the data out to construct interrelated set of arguments. And as you understand in this paper, that three arguments or that themes are connected to the three research questions that they already asked. So they want to explain, they want to understand from the data itself how certain boundary work is taking place, how the boundary work is happening in the textual space of social media. So they use their data, they analyze their data, they identify a specific set of codes through which they articulate a narrative or a story or an argument regarding the manner in which the boundary work of expanding the expertise domain of accountants happening in the social media. That's what they do. And similarly, you can understand they have another section in their paper talking about the rhetorical work. How, in this particular textual space, through their data set, they explain how the rhetorical work is happening in that particular textual space to expand the domain of accounting expertise. So that's the second key element they are talking about. So these are very directly related to the research questions they pose. And so they are mobilizing the data. So they analyze the data. That means they are mobilizing the data to construct that particular argument, the manner in which this work happening in the textual space. And thirdly, they have another subsection or a section to articulate the manner in which the embedded agency is constructed in the textual space of social media. So that's how they do it. So to repeat it, so when you are analyzing, when you are coding the textual data or the qualitative secondary data in qualitative content analysis, the process would be very similar to what we discussed under quantitative content analysis. You might have the upward or bottom to top coding or top to bottom coding, doesn't matter. So whatever the coding system you can use in the quantitative content analysis, you can use it in the exact manner. So you still do the similar kind of coding, a similar kind of identification. You identify the salient features, salient instances, concepts, variables, occurrences, and so on. So you have examples, you have illustrations to say that. So you pick the illustrations, you collect the illustrations. So this particular specific text and this particular piece of text and this particular piece of text illustrate this particular point. So that's the connection. So this textual data is evidences, the illustrations, or they exemplify the manner in which something is happening. So that's what they did. So they basically use the data set, use in various kind of codes, okay, to illustrate and exemplify and articulate arguments. So in this paper, they have 3 key arguments they promote in such a process of data analysis. Now, when it comes to qualitative content analysis, how do you present or report your findings and analysis? As I mentioned in my previous lecture, in the case of a quantitative content analysis, the reporting your findings is more or less straightforward. That is because a quantitative content analysis would be directed towards testing a set of hypotheses. Therefore, you would report whether your hypotheses have been accepted or rejected and under which probabilistic conditions. And you would also discuss how that acceptance or rejection of the hypothesis would implicate theoretically, literary, and policy or the managerial terms. So in that sense, in the case of a quantitative content analysis, the reporting is more or less straightforward with specific statistical tables that tells the probabilistic conditions under which the hypotheses have been accepted or rejected. But when it comes to the qualitative content analysis, the reporting is not that straightforward. The manner in which you explain your findings is not that straightforward. It all depends, so it is all contingent upon the specific set of arguments that you are going to construct. That depends on the specific narrative or the story that you want to tell or that you can tell from your data. Now, in the case of, for example, Surabhi and his colleagues' paper, you understand that the presentation of their analysis, reporting of their findings is structured into the key 3 arguments or the key 3 themes that they are articulating. And as we already discussed, these key 3 themes or the arguments have been framed in their research questions as well. The first one is related to the boundary work, how the boundary work is taking place in the textual space of social media and how such boundary work expand the domain of expertise in accounting. So, in the analysis and discussion and conclusions, they articulate under a specific heading how this happens, and they bring over data to support that. And similarly, in another section, they structure their paper into another section where they talk about the manner in which rhetorical work happens in the textual space of social media and how that expand the domain of expertise. And thirdly, they also talk about, as we already mentioned, how the construction of social agency takes place and how that expand the domain of expertise. So the point here is that basically the manner in which you present your data, the manner in which you organize your data, your findings and analysis depends on the specific set of arguments that you would construct from your data. So therefore it is very contingent. However, whatever the type of argument you would develop, a specific set of techniques, presentation techniques, data techniques can be still used as exemplified by this paper. For example, you can still use numerical data, statistical tables, quantitative numbers. You can still use them as in this particular case. You can use tables, you can use charts and diagrams, etc. For example, these are the examples you can think about how they present their quantified numerical data. But this data is used to articulate, to substantiate a particular argument. That's the point here. So in addition to such numerical tables, graphs and pictures, you can also use, for example, word clouds. These word clouds are a wonderful manner in which you can present visually how significant particular keywords are. So as we mentioned already, the coding is to identify the salient features of the text. Which keywords, which themes, which concepts would define saliently or characterize the text in a dominating manner. So you can visualize that. You can illustrate that wonderfully using word clouds, this example. And similarly, you can use the qualitative textual data in their native form. You can use them as simply paragraphs, quotation. So as they use it here. So they are interview transcripts or some quotation from particular, say, Twitter account. You can use it as they are, as to illustrate your specific point. So in a brief point, or to summarize, when it comes to the presentation or the reporting of your data in the qualitative content analysis, it is not that straightforward. It is rather contingent upon the specific set of arguments that you have to construct. But yet again, still you may think about the possibilities of using techniques such as graphs, charts, statistical tables, word clouds, and the quotations, etc. So those are the key points that you can borrow from this particular paper. So read this particular paper as well as some other papers and see how they present their data. So that's about the presentation of your data in a qualitative content analysis. So with that, we are coming to the end of this particular lecture. So we had 3 interrelated lectures regarding the topic of content analysis. In my very first lecture, I discussed the conceptual foundation of content analysis. There we understood the specific set of concepts or the context within which we can understand and explain content analysis. Our attention was mainly on the nature of the data that a content analysis would use. And there we understood that Whether it is quantitative content analysis or qualitative content analysis concentrate on qualitative data, secondary qualitative data. And we also discussed that when you are trying to explain and justify content analysis, you have to locate content analysis within the duality between text and the reality. So there is a particular reality that creates a particular set of text, and you have to locate your methodology, content analysis, to understand it properly. So in other words, content analysis is a methodology that would analyze the textual data, especially qualitative textual data, so that through such data you can reveal, you can explain, you can explore the reality problem that you are interested in. So that was our first lecture. Then in the second lecture we discussed the technical and procedural aspects of doing a quantitative content analysis. So there we discussed the manner in which a quantitative content analysis would frame the definition of your research problem, the methodology, analysis, and the presentation of your data. In a very similar fashion, in this lecture, we also discussed how a qualitative content analysis would frame the definition of your research problem, the methodology, analysis, and the presentation of your data. And to understand both these approaches, or to understand the content analysis in general, the best approach is to get some good example papers. Go through the example papers and see how you can yourself mobilize either quantitative content analysis or qualitative content analysis, or the both of them in your research project. And I am 100% sure that by watching this introductory set of lectures, you would not be totally competent, you would not be totally understand the content analysis, because this is just an introductory lecture. So it will provide you the basic, fundamental, or essential understanding of this particular methodology. So you have to supplement this introductory lecture by the set of recommended readings. So please go through the recommended readings, then you will be in a better position to operationalize your research project either through quantitative content analysis or qualitative content analysis, or any combination thereof. So with that note, I would finish this particular lecture saying thank you and goodbye.